Hi, my name is Gia Hamilton, and thank you for joining me for Live Your Purpose Artfully, a video series that looks at creatives and innovators who are living, working, and visiting the city of New Orleans. So I am here today with my both co-conspirator, that is the word I will use, collaborator, colleague, friend, Jocelyne Ninneman, who I've known now for almost 10 years.
Yeah. Well, how old is Isael?
Izzy is 11.
Yeah, that's how long.
Oh, 11 years. I stand corrected. And, you know, we share, I think, this love of culture. I think that was, like, the first thing that really, like, connected us. I remember we first met during Jazz Fest.
Yep, sure did.
We were at a sort of house party, and I got to
at Chantrell's. I think we were at Chantrell's house.
Yes, we were at Chantrell. Shout out to Chantrell.
Yes.
Chantrell's house, and we just kind of kept seeing each other, I think, in the same places, like, all the time, and then we finally, like, connected. But you have done some really, I think, incredible things in the city of New Orleans as just what I would say is an advocate for musicians and for artists, some of which are just the founder of Pomp Productions, and I'm going to let you talk a little bit about what that is, the music programming director at the Ace Hotel, Three Keys, so really, like, bringing new and innovative talent into the city, but also cultivating a real professional opportunity for upcoming talent in the city, among other things, and then just being a part of the cultural community, both as a writer, also as a producer, also as a person who works constantly on festivals. So I know these things pretty well, but tell us about, like, Pomp Productions, why you started it, and how it sort of lives now with your work at the Ace Hotel.
Well, Pomp Productions actually started in Detroit before I moved to New Orleans in 2005. So it actually wasn't born here in New Orleans.
Okay.
But it continued and expanded.
Okay.
So it started out as my own small boutique production house because I started working for myself in Detroit as an event producer, working for festivals or various venue clients. And really, I just did it because I needed to get a paycheck and they needed a W-9 that had a tax registration on it. And so I was forced to register a company and actually start to think about a logo and a website and those sorts of things because I started working for myself more and more. And then when I moved to New Orleans in 2005, after having been here a few years, I started doing similar contractual work for most of the festivals in town, for some of the venues, marketing consulting, promotions, a little bit of artist management here and there. I did most artist management when I was still based in Detroit. I didn't do so much of it when I was here in New Orleans, but a little bit.
Although everyone knows you.
Yeah.
You're like the unofficial manager of all the musicians here in the city.
Yes. I guess so. Yeah, I guess that's how it is. I said I wasn't doing artist management anymore, but by default, that's how that works.
Yes.
You know,
So you have a newsletter. And that newsletter is, I think, unique because you really do, you curate out the types of events that you go to, the things that you think people who are just coming into the city might want to go to, and I feel like it's grown over time. So, like, what are some of the brands and or things, how do you choose, like, who you represent in this newsletter?
I mean, really, it's mostly music-based, but there's also art and fashion and film involved. Honestly, it's just things that I think are really good and really amazing and people should come to them. Yeah. That's really all it is. Yeah. Honestly, it's just my own personal curatorial situation. Yes. And over 2,000 people have signed up for it over the years. And so once folks started to, somehow word got around at some point that I had a mailing list and some people should be on it, and people who were bringing independent artists to town or venues who needed assistance. Somehow word just got around that I had a mailing list, and when specific artists were coming to specific festivals or venues, people would be like, oh, there's this girl, she has this thing, you should probably do this. And so eventually, some venues and artists and festivals started to pay me to spread the word to that audience. Yeah. But it's always relevant, that's the thing. It's never, one of the reasons it hasn't grown past that point is because not just anything can make it. I definitely have had offers from other people who have wanted to promote specific types of parties or events or things, and if it's not a fit for that reader base, I just politely decline it.
Yeah.
Because then otherwise people will just, it'll be among the rest of the spam people get.
Yeah, and so I think so that fits this idea of like this niche group of people. Fits with kind of some of the things that I know about your background of like life in Detroit as a young person, like kind of deeply immersed in the music scene. So you have had this like wide range of experiences in the music world of producing things there. Take us back like 15 years and tell us like what was like Jocelyne Ninneman doing in Detroit? What kinds of
years.
What kind of things?
Without telling my age, 15 years ago. Let's see, it's 2018 now.
Yes.
So like 2003, what was happening? So this would have been just a few years before I moved here. Detroit was definitely struggling at the time. It was right before the other shoe kind of dropped in Detroit. I was a new grad from out of college, so getting a job wasn't very easy.
Yeah.
Which is why Pont Productions was kind of born. I was doing all these various things and got into the independent music scene pretty heavily because it was something we could control. And luckily I'm from Detroit where some of the best music in the world exists.
Yes.
And so, our artists in Detroit were being imported to other places and were making their money outside of Detroit. And there was a business there for that. And I saw a lot of promise in a lot of people, some of whom knew who they were and were very sure of their value, but a lot of other people who weren't so sure and who I just really felt needed to get out there and do those things because there was people in other places of the world that would pay them lots of money just to do what they do.
Yes.
So I started assisting several artists, particularly a lot of DJs and producers in the house music, techno music, and soul and funk music.
Anybody want to share?
No.
Just a lot.
No, just several. I would not want to call out any one or two artists. I mean, I love so many of them, but I feel like if I just name one or two people, I feel like they're more important.
So we're going to shout them all out.
Yes.
Everybody. Yes. And you're definitely known on the scene in Detroit. So like,
I mean, I guess. People
know when you're coming back into town.
For better or for worse. It might be a warning siren. I don't know. Watch out. I don't know. I think it was mostly, that was it. It was the driving people on the independent scene because there wasn't, venues were closing, businesses were closing in Detroit at the time. There weren't a lot of outlets. And so it was to say that it's a DIY situation is an understatement. Everything we did was DIY because there was no investment on that level and anything that was culturally based really at the time. Everything was on decline. So those sorts of programs were getting cut out from everything.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was a big turning point there were two big turning points. One was I started an internship when I was still an undergrad with the New Center Council, which at the time was the CDC for essentially my neighborhood and kind of beyond. And they produced one of the city's biggest annual festivals, which at the time was called Detroit Taste Fest. And for 20 years, it was like the city's favorite summer festival. It happened for 5 days over 4th of July weekend, and joining that team and working on that was amazing. I started as an intern, and then they eventually hired me. And so that is how I got into festival production work, was working on that team and working on that project. And what was happening concurrently is I had been volunteering for the Detroit Electronic Music Festival in its initial first 3 years. The very first year was in 2000, so that first 3 years was the inception of what is now known as the Movement Festival, which is one of the most premier electronic music festivals in the world. And so I volunteered the first year as the assistant merchandise coordinator for the festival. That's how I got my wee little beginnings.
I love all these titles, right?
Assistant merchandise coordinator. So in like 99, 2000, that's how that began. And at the moment of standing at the top of the Hart Plaza Bowl and watching 300,000 people show up to Detroit for that festival against all odds with no support from the city, with a few fiscal sponsors, and we just all kind of looked at each other like, we did it.
Wow.
So that feeling is what kind of came over me and drove us to move forward. And And then I also started managing Detroit House Music Collective and DJ Collective and a small record label, and which at the time was called Detroit Beatdown, and then later became Beatdown Sounds and Strictly Beatdown, and managed them and their world tours and things like that, and their website, and their local promotions for their local residencies for like, I don't even know, 5, 6, 7 years. It's a little fuzzy, I don't know, but and then that is what, and I also started a mailing list in Detroit, which was the precursor to the Pomp Productions mailing list. What was it called? It was called, oh my god, I still remember this. I had university dial-up and my giant PC on my laptop, and I remember typing this. It was called
dial-up. Yes.
It was called Where You Need to Be in Detroit This Week. That's what it was called. So cheesy and terrible. So terrible.
But it was direct and explicit.
It was. So, it was here's where you need to be this week, and it was a text-only email that I manually put together and manually sent out to like a whole bunch of people, and it became a thing. And then a young woman who was about my age, who had also gone to my alma mater but had moved out to Chicago and then to LA, we had worked together on we crossed paths. She started a new company called Musicology, and she reached out to me at the end of 2003, I think, maybe 2004, and said she was looking to expand the company and presented her idea, and that she heard that I was kind of already doing what she envisioned in Detroit. And so we eventually partnered up, like within a year or so. We launched the Detroit chapter of the company, and then so on and so forth until I think 6 or 7 years later, when we parted ways. But over that 6 or 7 years, we developed what then became, with several other amazing people across the country and into Canada and around the world, developed Musicology, which became an innovative platform pre-Facebook.
Wow.
So before I knew it, we were in technology.
Yeah.
So starting to get invited to places like Winter Music Conference and College Music Journal Conference at NYU and South by Southwest and Tech Week and things like that. I don't think at the time we really knew what was going on in terms of like how forward it was. But it was happening before. Facebook didn't come out until 2006, and we existed in 2004. So we were 2 years ahead of Facebook in terms of a social platform for like-minded folks to self-select other events and people in cities across the country. I think when I left at the end of 2010, there was something like 25 chapters across North America.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And 125,000 members or 150,000 members.
Yeah. So, and then just doing this passion work that you love, which was like, you know, being on the scene, being that person who was like, you know, the taste, you know, maker who's like ear to the ground, kind of has the finger on the pulse of like what is happening in a place. So when you came to New Orleans, I mean, I think I think there's similarities around like how musicians make money, how talent makes money, you know, in cities like Detroit and New Orleans. Like, what was it like really trying to like immerse yourself in a city like New Orleans that is also like closed in many ways to outsiders? Like, you have kind of like cracked that code in many ways.
I mean, I think it's attributed mostly to being from Detroit, because we're the same way.
You're like, no,
we're different in one way. We're different in one way in the sense that I think, unfortunately, Detroiters tend to give the keys to our city away much sooner than a New Orleanian will, which is a problem. But very similar in the sense that there's a cultural self-pride on a certain level where we're not easily impressed.
Yeah. You're
so,
like, prove it.
I mean, New Orleans is like, we invented jazz. Sit down and learn something. Detroit is like, we invented Motown and techno. Sit down. So it's this sort of, also the people in both cities, to me, are very genuine and very real. And they're not necessarily, relationships with people in both cities, to me, are based on a genuine, broader goal and longer term situation. They're not based on an immediate business transaction. or something that is surface level image bearing. So I think that those two. So I just saw that New Orleanians were a lot like Detroiters, but I happened to come also the year of Katrina. So when I saw what New Orleanians were going through, it felt very similar to what Detroit was going through.
Yeah.
And so I immediately empathized with New Orleanians and kind of understood that when you feel like your core is being taken away from you and you can't do anything about it, I immediately understood the ways in which New Orleanians wanted to do things. And I think that's what assisted me in like cracking the New Orleans code. Also, I just put in work.
Yeah.
Like you just pay it forward. That's also just that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now, you know, I mean, you really are this key person in the city who manages like, you know, a venue that, quite frankly, like everybody wants to play, right? You know, everybody wants an opportunity to like, to basically work with you and your team because, you know, it's the kind of hip happening, you know, space in the city. Like, what is your vision for that space or for that work? Like, what do you want to see happen with, you know, working with artists, working with musicians and talent?
Well, particularly in New Orleans, I think for Three Keys, my main goal as the music program manager there is to help facilitate a place for two things. One is collaboration, and two is progression in the music, innovation and progression. I'd never visited here in the 80s, but in having many conversations with a lot of artists over the past decade in New Orleans, there's been conversations surrounding like what happened in New Orleans in the 80s or early 90s. It seems like something happened where the music just stopped progressing. It didn't stop progressing, but the innovation level was not as magnanimous as it was up until that point.
Yeah.
And some folks have attributed it to there was cuts in funding for public programs and schools and things, and crime rates shot up, and there was a lot of problems there in the 80s and early 90s. And then other people don't necessarily discuss that. Other conversations have talked about that tourism really started to get pushed to the forefront of the economy in the city in the 80s and 90s, or late 80s and early 90s. And musicians would find a living only by playing tourist gigs. And tourist gigs, of course, are going to exist for 10 classic songs, jazz standards or When the Saints and things like that. And so when you have to spend so much time performing only certain songs for a specific audience, it's less time that you have to work on your own music or work on new music or original music.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's been something that has only been exacerbated all the way up until now. So for me, at Three Keys, it really hopefully is a platform for people to collaborate on, push people to innovate and progress the music, and hopefully new music and original music, and also as a platform for rising artists to come out, come out on that stage.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like I have seen people that maybe I've heard of or maybe even take for granted in the city, but I see them through your lens. I listen to them through your lens at Three Keys, and it's like, your word, your curatorial eye and ear, has weight in the city.
Oh, does it?
It does.
Okay.
It absolutely does. People want to be, in that space. And I think you've also done a lot of indirect mentoring of people, and really trying to make sure that they kind of that the industry is more transparent. Mm-hmm. They understand how to do that work better for themselves. So it's been really, really incredible to watch this journey of you kind of having mastery of these two spaces. And so I guess my final question is what do you need to continue to do this work? Or if you were talking to a group of people who could support your work, what kind of things would be helpful?
Well, everybody's always going to say more money, right? Everybody's always going to say that.
That comes up a little bit.
The arts need money, right?
Yeah.
However, it's not just, people need sponsors or grants or whatever. New Orleans specifically, which is the other thing that is relatable to Detroit, is it's a spoiled, saturated market, a spoiled, saturated city in the sense that the ratio of talented performer to regular consumer is drastically heavier on the talented performer side. So everybody in New Orleans is a performer or artist in some sense of the word, and truly, not just I wrote 4 words once and it was good. You know, like, people are truly talented, and they're raised in environments and in families that bring forth and perpetuate this sort of talent. And it's hard when everybody feels like they're a part of the performance base and not necessarily the listener base, because then nobody thinks they have to pay for performances. The problem is that shows are expensive, and I think that people don't think that they have to pay for shows. There's so much good free music in New Orleans.
Yeah, on any given day.
On any given day, and there's so much of it, and it is actually decent. It's not all good, but a lot of it is good.
Yeah.
And if so much of it is free or cheap, it's very hard to change the mentality of folks. So working on a sort of social, economic change in folks, where they're prioritizing actually putting their money toward other folks' performances and their other folks' art, would be helpful, because we can't just rely on sponsors and grants all the time to make that happen.
Pay it forward, right? Like, step up and support the artists and musicians in your
Especially if you want to be paid, if you as an artist or a performer, if you think you're worth it, and your show is worth it, then certainly you have peers who are also worth it, and you should support them as well and not expect to not pay all the time.
Absolutely. So I really want to thank you. Again, as a person who is usually in the seat of advocate and support, I think it's like incredibly helpful to be able to hear the vision and to just hear like what makes, you know, our advocates tick, what makes our other creatives who are supporting, you know, the culture in the city tick. So I'm super grateful that we were able to talk today.
Thank you for having me. For sure. Thank you, Gia.
Yes,
Appreciate
absolutely.
you.
I've been wanting to do that.